Hello, I'm Ed Chisholm, and in this video I'm going to talk you through how to get your drum kit set up as comfortably as possible, talking you through some tips one piece at a time. As you can see, I haven't got much in front of me right now, so what we're going to do is one at a time, add the different components of the drum kit, talk about what sort of position they want to be in, and as I say, by the end of this video, hopefully we'll end up with a kit that's nicely set up, that's comfortable to play, and that leaves us sat in a comfortable position as well, which isn't to be overlooked. Now, as a drum teacher, I, through no fault of their own, have plenty of students who sometimes don't have their kits set up in quite the best way that they possibly could. Obviously, this is mainly talking about slightly less experienced students, sometimes just younger students, but not necessarily just younger. It could be older students who just haven't been playing as long, so it's not an age thing by any means, but those who aren't quite as experienced with a drum kit might not know how to set it up as best as they possibly can. I remember that from my own early drumming days. I'd spend so much time fiddling and tinkering with my setup at home, trying to get it just right, or trying to copy it from pictures or videos of drummers that I'd seen. And to a certain extent, it was through all that tinkering that I learnt about it. But the point of this video is mainly as a resource that I can pass to my students as and when they need a hand. But obviously, this is here for all to see. So I hope that it might be helpful to you. Whether you're a student yourself, whether you're the parent of a younger student who might need to give a hand getting the kit set up, or even if you've been drumming a little while, but there may well be some tips in here that I've picked up along the way, which I would love to share with you. So let's get started. So we're going to start from nothing really and work our way up to a full kit. Now, you see I've got the bass drum here, but before I even talk about that, the first important thing to talk about is the stool, or your drum throne. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are sat in such a way that I always refer to this with my students as almost like we're making a triangle. So we've got a nice, sturdy, solid base, like a tripod between our feet and our backsides. We don't want to be sitting so that we're closer to one foot than the other, or so that our feet are kind of so far away like this, or that we're sitting sort of on top of our feet. As I say, I like to imagine it's a bit like a sort of almost an equilateral triangle. Hey, this isn't a maths lesson, but you get the idea, so that our feet and our core are an even distance apart. Now, I'm not going to get too into all the mechanics of all these movements, because one, I'm not qualified to do so, and two, if I did, this video would go on for hours, but a very simple illustration of this that someone showed me once, or that I saw in another video, was if you sit with your feet too far away, with your feet flat on the floor, you won't be able to very easily lift your heels up while keeping your toes on the ground. The other way around, if you sit with your feet underneath you, hopefully you can see this in the bottom of the screen, if you sit with your feet almost underneath you, you won't be able to lift your toes up very easily. And we want to be able to move our feet pretty freely when we're playing the drums, so that we can play the pedals as best we can. So, as I say, I like to think of it, if I now put myself in position, I like to think of it that my thighs are just slightly sloping downwards in terms of the height of the stool. I'm not sitting so high that I can't reach the floor, and I'm not sitting so low that my knees are high up. I'm sitting, as I say, in a position where my thighs are slightly sloping down, and then my knee is almost on top of my heel, vertically speaking. As I say, that's the same for both legs. I make sure I'm not sitting closer to one than the other, but there we go. That's obviously going to be different for everybody depending on their height, and the length of your legs and all sorts of things. So it's really is a sort of a tailored thing to you. So, to sum up with that, we want to make sure we're sat with our thighs sloping downwards and our knees above our heels. That should give you a good ballpark, and that way we can move both our toes and our heels freely. Okay, next up, so you see I've already got the bass drum here. I left this here to start with, and then we're going to build up from here. So first of all, I'm going to simply I'm right-handed, so we'll be setting up the kit in a right-handed way. I'm going to put my right foot on the bass drum pedal, and essentially wherever my left foot falls then, to a certain extent, leaving space for the snare drum in between, wherever my left foot falls, that's where I'm going to put my hi-hats. I'm not going to, as I said when I was talking about positioning our feet, I'm not going to sort of have them in a way that they're not the same distance apart. I'm going to just put my feet down comfortably, maybe sort of shoulder width apart with my knees, or maybe a little bit more depending on, as I say, the size of my snare drum. But that's where I'm going to put my hi-hat stand. So I'm just going to grab this. Here we go. There's no cymbals on here just yet, but I'm going to put that, there we go, just like that. So hopefully it comes across that I've got a nice equal sort of triangle shape between, as I said a minute ago, my feet and my stool. Okay, next up, let's get the snare drum. Now the snare drum is going to sit in between the pedals. So as I briefly mentioned a minute ago, you do need to make sure when you move your left foot, for instance, for the hi-hat, that you do leave enough space for the snare drum. It's no use having it right next to your, it wouldn't be any use having your hi-hat pedal, for instance, here, because otherwise there's not going to be space for the snare drum. So we do need to make certain considerations. But there we go, just to point that out. I'm going to, as I go through this video, I'm hopefully going to try and address the most basic of things, just to make sure that even if this is the first time you're setting up a drum kit, that you can follow it, and I'm not assuming that you have any prior experience. So as I say, hopefully this doesn't seem like I'm stating the obvious too much. Right, so I've now got the snare, my feet are the distance apart where my feet naturally kind of fell, and I've got my snare drum sat just between my knees. Now this is really important, and this is something I'm always really keen to point out to my students. The snare drum is what I always consider, the central point of the drum kit. So many times people look at the bass drum, and because it's big, and to be honest, when we've added all the other components, it might look more like the central point. But when we've just got the bass drum, the snare drum and the hi-hat stand, with the pedal of course, hopefully this really clearly shows that actually the snare drum is in the middle. Based on how we said we're going to sit, the snare drum is right in front of me. I'm not sitting facing, say, my bass drum or my hi-hat, which would of course cause me to twist off-centre one way or the other. I'm facing the snare drum. In terms of angle and height, we want to try and make sure that the snare drum, well, with any of the drums, and this is what I'll get to as we go through the video, we want to make sure that whatever height we hit a drum, or cymbal, slightly different with the cymbals, but particularly with the drums, we want to make sure that whatever height our stick makes contact with the drum, our stick and the drum that we're hitting are going to be almost parallel. Now they can't be exactly parallel, because otherwise I'll hit the rim before I hit the drum skin, like that. But we want to make sure that, assuming we're going to hit the drum skin first, we're going to be almost parallel at the point of contact. Okay? So if a drum is higher up, it's going to be slightly more tilted towards us, so it'll be parallel hopefully with my hand there. If we had a drum at this sort of height, if we had a drum at this height, hopefully it would be that sort of angle. As a general rule, that's what I try and go off. Right, so in terms of height, I tend to get my snare drum so that it is almost I remember one of my first drum teachers always said it wants to be about the height of your belt buckle. Okay? We don't want it too low, because we don't want to have it so low that we're sort of hitting our leg every time we come down. And we don't want to have it so high that we're having to sort of reach over the top of the hoop, the rim, to make sure we hit it, okay? So, as I say, angle-wise, it wants to be pretty much parallel with the stick when it gets to this sort of height. And height-wise, as I say, it's going to depend on the height of your seat and many other things, but a belt buckle sort of height is a good indicator, generally. Okay, there's our snare drum. So now we've got bass drum, snare drum, hi-hat. Let me put the hi-hat cymbals on the hi-hat stand. I just wanted to make sure you could see the snare drum clearly while I did this, so here we go. I'll just slide the bottom one straight over the top. There, and the top cymbal, as I say, not wanting to assume that folks already know all of this, let me just show you. So we have the clutch, which is this part here. It's got a felt, another felt, and then a nut that goes on the bottom. We're going to put this over the top of the hi-hat, there we go. Felt, and then the nut underneath, there we go. And that just sits on top. Like that. Then just gently, don't push it all the way down, but if you put your foot down maybe an inch or two, and then tighten this up, your hi-hat should open nicely. As I say, you can tweak it to make sure it's a comfortable gap, but as I say, maybe an inch or two is a good guideline there. Okay, right. let's add the toms. Okay, so bear with me a moment while I bring them over. As I say, I'm kind of keen to do this video all in one take, so apologies if it's not the smoothest take, but I wanted to show you what it looks like in real time as we add the different components. So, bear with me one moment, thank you. Here comes a middle tom, which is going to sit over here. Move that out the way. Here comes a floor tom, which is going to sit about here, and then the high tom. Alrighty, so obviously I have pre-configured my stands and the legs on my floor tom in such a way that they're already in a comfortable position, just by putting the stands in the right place, which obviously isn't how they start off. You have to get them into that position. But let me just talk to you about the positions that I've put these toms in. Okay, so first of all, the floor tom, I like to pretty much mirror my snare drum, so it's about the same height and about the same angle, because remember, when we hit things at this height, we're going to try and match the angle of the drum with the angle of the stick, so they're almost parallel, like I said with the snare drum. Hopefully it'll be the same thing with the floor tom here. Okay. A quick pointer with the floor tom. In terms of setting it up, the way I always like to position the legs, most of the time if it's a floor tom with legs on the floor rather than a hanging one, we'll have 3 legs. I like to put 2 at the back, and then the third leg closest to me, so the drum is almost facing me. And then if I set the 2 at the back to one height, so to be honest I always have them almost at the top of the legs on these particular drums, then on this front leg I can just angle the drum back or forth depending on how high I have it on that leg that's closest to me, and that way it's going to be nice and easy to get it in position. Again, that's one of the things which I remember spending ages fiddling around with in my sort of younger drumming days, just trying to get all 3 legs at the right sort of height. But yes, what I've settled on doing is put the 2 at the back at the same height, whichever height that is, and then just vary the height of the front leg, the closest one, to get the angle that you desire on the top of the drum. Okay, up at the top here, our high tom and our middle tom on this kit. Again, same rule. I've got them to a height where they're almost that same sort of parallel angle as I would make contact with them. Obviously they're a little bit more angled because they're higher up, because they obviously need to be over the bass drum. And again, it's just worth pointing out that I'm still considering the snare drum as the central point on the drum kit. We've got obviously all this stuff over here, and now this is, hopefully you can see why sometimes people get slightly tricked into thinking the bass drum is the central point, but in terms of how we sit and the position we're in, as I say, we want the snare drum to be the focal point. Now, I've got my toms on tom stands on this particular drum kit. However, you might have a kit where the toms are mounted off the bass drum. In some ways, that can make life easier, depending on the setup you're after. If you're just after a simple standard setup, to be honest, that usually is easier. But you can have more options when they're not mounted off the bass drum. Not that that matters right now, but what you would want to do, as I say, is get the toms in such a position that they are a suitable angle. I always try and sort of mirror the angle between the 2 of them. Sometimes you'll see them when they're sort of way up here and they're almost at, I wonder if I just take this off if I just show you. We want to make sure that they're not sort of right up here and almost facing the drummer, and that way we'd sort of be swiping at the drum as we hit it. And we also don't really want them to be too flat in such a way that we have to reach almost over the top of the rim in order to hit the drum skin, that is. Okay, so obviously depending on a number of variables like the height we're sitting at, how tall the drummer is, the height of the bass drum, we might be able to get the toms then lower and flatter. Some people do like to have their toms pretty flat, but as I say, that's going to depend on the size of the bass drum, the height of the drummer, how high up the seat is. I generally, as I say, try and get my, so my 12-inch tom here is slightly deeper than my 10-inch tom. I try and get fairly close to the top of my bass drum, not so close that it's going to hit it or rub against it, but I want them to be as low as I can comfortably get them over the top of the bass drum, but still at a suitable angle that I can hit them. And as I say, as I keep coming back to, that the stick is almost parallel to the drum. Okay, in terms of distance from me, again, they're all easily within reach with both hands. I'm not having to stretch to get to anything. Everything's just where I would kind of naturally reach for it. Okay, that would be the same, by the way, if I was to have more floor toms or more toms. You can see there's a gap here where sometimes I'll mount an 8-inch tom. So the same thing would apply. I would just make sure that the angle was suitable and the height was suitable. But yes, no matter how many components you add, I follow those rules. One more thing that I might just mention is I do slightly bring my middle tom slightly inwards, so that rather than them completely mirroring each other, where this would actually be a bit further back, as I say, I have this slightly closer in, so they're at a little bit more of a, obviously they're not quite in a straight line, but they are sort of, they're not, it's not a complete mirror image, as I say. The 12-inch tom I do just bring slightly closer, so that, as I say, I can just reach it just as comfortably rather than having to stretch a bit to get to the centre of the drum. Okay, right, let's get our couple of cymbals, and then we'll be well on our way to getting this kit fully set up. Okay, bear with me. Now, sorry, I'll wait till I'm in front of the camera to talk. Here we go. Just tuck that under there. Okay. Now, it's worth mentioning that with this particular setup that I've got hardware-wise, as I mentioned, I use these tom stands. I tend to mount my cymbals off the tom stands. You can see there's a clamp at the back of each one, so I've got them all pre-configured, but for the sake of this video I wanted to do them with separate cymbal stands so I could talk you through positioning them as best as I can. Okay, so we've got one stand over here which is going to position our ride cymbal in a moment, which I will just get vaguely in position. Something like that, I would imagine. And then this one is going to be for our crash cymbal. Again, I'll just move the legs around a bit just to get it in just the right sort of place. This one I don't think I'll need to bend, so I will keep that straight. Let's remove the wing nuts. Here we go. I'll just put those aside. And I'm going to grab a crash cymbal and a ride cymbal to put on them. Okay. So let me just get these in position and I'll tell you a little bit about the positions I have put them in. So there's my ride. I'm going to want to angle that a bit more now that it's on the stand. And here's my crash, which to be honest looks pretty good. So I'll come back to the ride in a moment because there's a little bit more I want to talk to you about the positioning of the ride cymbal. So the crash cymbal, as I say, I'm actually pretty happy with that. What I might do is just shuffle it slightly away from me, like so, and I might actually make it a tiny bit lower. But there we go, that is about where I would want my crash cymbal. Now, what am I thinking about there? What considerations am I making? Well, when we hit cymbals, we're going to hit them in a slightly different way to how we hit the drums, okay? Because certain cymbals want to be hit with the tip of the stick, and certain cymbals want to be hit with the shoulder of the stick. Of course, those aren't rules, and we can change the techniques we use to get different sounds out of cymbals, but as a general rule of thumb and an introduction to hitting the cymbals and getting them in the right position, our crash cymbal, we want to hit with the shoulder of the stick. So that means we want the cymbal to be slightly flatter, okay? So the position that I've got this in, I'll come back to the ride cymbal in a moment, does mean that when I meet the cymbal at this height, the first bit that's going to make contact is, as I say, the shoulder of the stick and the edge of the cymbal. Okay? Like that. That's just going to give us the sound that we generally want from a crash cymbal to allow it to open up and make a nice, suitable crash cymbal sound, which is what we're after. Okay, yeah, I'm really happy with that. I'm going to leave that there. With the ride cymbal, as I say, I'm going to angle it a bit more towards me. Little more this way. You do get used to angling the drums and cymbals, knowing which bit you need to adjust to get it where you want it. Again, that's something that through years of fiddling around and tinkering, you sort of get more comfortable with. Knowing exactly how to get what you want, where you want it. As I say, I remember spending hours probably in my earlier days thinking, I really want to get this cymbal in this position or this position, but I couldn't work out how to get it there. And as I say, just through experimenting, you do eventually get things, figure out more easily how to get things where you want them. Okay, so just shuffle that back just a little tiny bit. There we go. So my ride cymbal. So where the ride cymbal is different to the crash cymbal, the first point of the stick that's going to make contact with it is, as opposed to the shoulder of the stick that's going to meet the edge of the crash cymbal, when we hit the ride cymbal, we want the tip of the stick to meet the top part, or the bow, it may be called, of the cymbal. So again, this is just by sitting in as much of a natural and comfortable position as possible. There we go. Of course, again, it's worth mentioning that after time, you just grow to recognise what the kit should look like and how you know you're going to feel comfortable as a drummer. But of course, it takes a while to build that up. For instance, I could sit at this kit and even just by looking at it, go, yeah, I'm going to be able to comfortably play this. Whereas earlier on, you might not be able to just identify and recognise that just by looking at it. You might actually have to play it and then think, oh, hang on, this isn't right, or that's not right. So, as I say, again, that might take a little time to get used to. But yes, with our ride cymbal, we want the tip of the stick to meet the bow of the cymbal without us really having to try to do that. As I say, we don't want to be having to angle the stick in such a way that we're having to get to the top. We want to just put your arm down and there it is. In fact, with the ride cymbal, we spend quite a lot of time on the ride cymbal, so it's worth it being especially comfortable. I like to make sure my elbow can be just tucked in, just relaxed by my side, and it's literally just from my elbow like that. I sometimes describe it as like I'm giving it sort of a thumbs up to my students. So my thumb just points straight up towards the tip, to the central point of the ride cymbal. In terms of position on the kit, I tend to have it just slightly overlapping my middle tom and my floor tom. Sometimes you'll see people have it sort of just over their floor tom so they can get it lower. But the problem with that is it means we have to really open up to get to it, rather than things being in this kind of quite close-knit sort of area just in front of us, that when we're playing the drums, we never have to spread out more than, say, this. Obviously, again, it goes without saying, if I was to add more components, we might have to move and twist a bit, but as far as the basic kit goes, I want all of these main components to be well within reach, without me having to really stretch or reach to try and get to different parts of the kit. I think that should leave us in a position where we've got the kit set up pretty comfortably. Now, I'm sorry, I know I've probably glazed over quite a few things, and I'm aware this video is already pretty long, so I don't want to keep going, but please do, if you've got any questions about how I got the kit set up in this way, or if things might be a bit different with your kit at home, then please do let me know in the comments, and I would be very happy to try and help you as best I can. But yes, I do hope that's been helpful, and I hope that as a result of this, you're able to get your drum kit set up nice and comfortably, and therefore play it as easily and efficiently as possible without that feeling like a challenge, that you can just sit and feel comfortable at the drums and get on with having fun playing them. As I say, hope that's helpful, but let me know if you've got any questions, and I will look forward to catching you another time. Take care and all the best. Bye.